that day with the JBS Mental Health Authority folks. They spend a lot of the day out actually in a facility. Jim Kriego and his folks at JBS Mental Health Authority do a great job of having people with lived experience come and talk to them and make sure that the law enforcement people interact with these folks. There's a place out in Gardendale where a lot of JBS patients actually get to live once they're out on their own. And we take the law enforcement folks into a place like this. We also take them to the JBS headquarters and let them kind of see the way people with mental illness deal with, the different things they have to deal with at JBS. And then on the afternoon of the Thursday, we start into scenarios. And that's some of the stuff I want to talk about today because we haven't really talked about it before. And that is we will give the law enforcement officers a scenario and say, okay, what would you do if you confront this situation? And we have folks who love to act like me. I love to be an actor. I'm sure y'all can all tell that. I love to be on stage. And so I'll go out there and, play the primary role they get me to play sometimes is a teenage boy who is contemplating suicide. Now, I don't look anything like a teenage boy, that's for darn sure. But I do, I act the situation where the teenage boy is contemplating suicide. His father has died. His mother is having a hard time coping. And then we get these folks to come in and exercise what we call, and this is what I want to talk about first today, is what we call the 4 plays. So when we do crisis intervention team training, and I hope everyone who understands this stuff a little will know what I'm talking about, but I didn't go into exactly what CIT is at the beginning because we've spoken with y'all before, and I think most everybody knows that. But I will mention it before we're done. But the 4 plays was something that the folks in Memphis who sort of invented CIT almost 40 years ago, in response actually to the shooting of a black teenage mentally ill man, actually boy, I think he was about 17 years old, was shot, and it led to protests throughout the community. It led to lots of problems within the community there. There were folks who were very upset with the way the police were handling everything. And to his everlasting credit, one of the leaders of the Memphis police department there met with the local NAMI leadership and basically said, hey, we know we screwed this up, right? This young man should not be dead. He should be alive. And we want to work with you to develop a program to train our officers in how to deal with this properly. And CIT was born through that interaction, through the compassion of Sam, the Major Sam, who was the guy who was still the chairman of the board of CIT International. So anyway, the 4 plays is this, because and what we try to teach folks is when you're dealing with a criminal, when you're going out to make an arrest, there are certain techniques that you exercise. But when you know that you're going out to deal with an individual who's in a mental health crisis, you want to go with a totally different set of tools, a totally different toolbox. And the first tool in your toolbox is compassion. And so what you want to do, this is so weird, y'all, and law enforcement people will look at us like we are Martians when we first tell them this. But the first thing you do when you arrive on a scene as a law enforcement officer and you know someone's in a mental health crisis is you introduce yourself to that person. And of course, the law enforcement people are like, what? You never introduce yourself to a criminal. You just say, hey, I'm the police and you're getting in the back of my car and I'm going to put you in the handcuffs, right? That's the way they're trained. That's what they do. But when you're coming to a mental health crisis, one of the worst things you can do is just start yelling at the person. There's a wonderful presentation that we do every year at our conference. It's in August. This year's going to be down in Orlando. And it's called Drop the Knife. And what happens, and of course, I've seen it multiple times now, so I know what's coming. But there's a lecturer up at the front who's you think he's just talking about crisis intervention training, crisis intervention team training. And then all of a sudden, somebody bursts into the back holding a knife. Now, it's a rubber knife. We don't let him a real knife. And he deals with the person first as if he's a criminal. and like just yells at him, "You better drop that knife," screaming. I'm not going to scream like they do because it's really, really loud. And they scream, "Drop the knife, drop the knife." And of course, the person eventually, they show how you make an arrest. Then they demonstrate how you would deal differently with that person if you knew this was an individual in a mental health crisis. And what the lecturer will do is introduce himself, say, "Hey, I'm Officer Wayne Rogers. I'm with the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. I'm here to talk to you today about what's going on with you." And you literally introduce yourself. The second play of the 4 plays is find out the person's name. Now, sometimes you know the person's name. This is because people with mental illness deal with the same law enforcement officers a fairly decent amount of time. A lot of times the officer knows the person. They've taken them into crisis care multiple times. The person may have had multiple hearings in their life where they have gone into involuntary commitment on multiple occasions. I think most of y'all on this call will know the median amount of time in an involuntary commitment in Alabama right now is about 14 days. It's about 2 weeks. So the individual so then we find out their name. And once you know the name, once you start a conversation with them, the third play of the 4 plays is called labeling the emotions. So the officer is then trained to try to understand, try to express what they believe the individual is going through. So it might be, it really seems to me like you're very frightened right now. Are you scared of something right now? And again, this is something you would not in a million years do with someone who's a real criminal, right? But it's something that law enforcement has to learn to deal with these people who are in the mental health crisis. So we say, are you confused? Are you angry at someone? Are you frustrated about something? And try to express what the person is actually feeling right then. And then finally, the fourth of the 4 plays is to paraphrase the situation. It's an active listening and understanding. I'm trying to, I believe what you're telling me, and this is after some interaction, of course, with the individual. I believe what you're telling me is, I'm just going to give an example here. You're really angry because no one in your family will listen to you. And those are the ways, those are de-escalation techniques that we train to these law enforcement officers who then are very, very good, the ones who are very good. And Sean and I talked about this before y'all came on here a minute ago. There is a major debate among the law enforcement community over who all should get this training. When I first got into CIT, I thought, well, we should train everybody. We should literally train every single law enforcement officer on CIT. They should all know how to do it. And that's kind of the position Jefferson County Sheriff's Office has taken. We have, in fact, trained everyone that we can. We actually did a 2-day course for our cadets last week. They graduate this Friday. And it was a week before last. We did a 2-day course for them in CIT. So we do provide everyone some training, that 2-hour, that 16-hour class, the 2-day class. Everyone is mandated to take that. We do not mandate that everyone take the 40-hour class, which is the more extensive one. And Jefferson County is very unusual in that every law enforcement officer in this county is empowered to do this work, whether they want to or not. It's a very strange old statute from the 1970s that says every single APOS certified law enforcement officer in Jefferson County has the authority to do what we now call CIT, which is very strange. The other 66 counties in Alabama, there's no such thing. Each one of them are designated to do the work. They're designated by the probate judge. They'll pick 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 people to do the work. And those are the folks who get the 40-hour training. We're very interested in it because I'm going to be honest with you, there's a lot of law enforcement who really hate this. They do not want to deal with it. They think that they went into law enforcement just to arrest people and take them to jail, and that's what they want to do. And we have made a lot of progress with those folks. If you can get a person like that to come to a CIT class, and you can't always do that, but when you do, oftentimes they become big advocates of CIT. And a lot of there's some great stories of, hardened, crusted, old, law enforcement officers been around for 20 years, take their first CIT class, and they're like, wow, this stuff really works. So, all right. So that's the 4 plays. That's what we teach as part of the tactics. But I want to switch gears now and talk about the thing that we're really emphasizing from a national standpoint right now in CIT is constitutional issues. So I'll tell you guys the story real quick, but I got to take a drink of my Diet Dr. Pepper first. So give me one sec. So back in the early 1980s, and this, I told you CITs really started in 1989, but part of the origins of CIT goes back to a case that happened in Tennessee in the early 80s. It actually happened in Nashville, Tennessee, not in Memphis, Tennessee. But at the time, the entire country followed what was called the fleeing felon rule. Now, just take a second to explain to you the fleeing felon rule came from common law. And one thing, maybe I shouldn't talk about this, Sean, but I'm talking about it for a second anyway. Many people on this call may not know that in common law, back in the days of England, when the kings were still all powerful and so on, every felony was punishable by death. Okay, so this is the background of that. If you committed a felony, it was punishable by death. There was no such thing as, they didn't have prisons, they had jails to hold people for a little while they did the investigation. But once the investigation was done, if an individual was found to have committed a felony, the death penalty was the only penalty. They didn't send them to prison. Now we're talking 500 years ago at this point, okay? So from those days, there developed something called the fleeing felon rule. And the fleeing felon rule basically said, if a law enforcement officer has probable cause to believe that someone has committed a felony, that officer can use all the force necessary to bring that person down. If they're trying to get away, you see someone who has robbed a bank, they're running away from robbing a bank. I think I told the story last time I was on about me being in a bank robbery back in 1980. I won't tell that again today. But one of the guys who robbed the bank, gets in a car outside and takes off. Under the fleeing felon rule, basically, if a police officer saw this happening and had an AK-47, they could shoot the car up and try to kill the person. Okay, that was the rule until 1985, which is kind of strange when you think about it. But when you think about going back to what it was before, if anyone convicted of a felony was going to be executed anyway, then the fleeing felon rule would say, if I have probable cause to believe I think this person committed a felony, I've got really good evidence that they did, then I can kill them as opposed to letting them get away, because that's what's going to happen if I catch them. They're going to get executed, right? Well, you can see how that might clash with modern sensibility. Once we have prisons, once we have places to send people, once we have the idea of, look, we're not trying to kill all these folks. You shouldn't be executed for stealing $50, which is what happened to people back in the common law days. But so it clashes with that sensibility. But where does the new rule come from? Well, the new rule comes from a 1985 U.S. Supreme Court case called Tennessee versus Garner. So Mr. Garner was a young man, or actually the Garner who's in the case was the father of the young man. The young man robbed a liquor store. He gets away. He's running down the street. The police are called very quickly. They set off an alarm in the liquor store, and the police are chasing him down the street. And now the young man is in much better shape than the police officers who are chasing after him. He's kind of getting away. He's running down the street, and he comes to a fence. He starts climbing up the fence, and as he's about to jump over the fence, which the officers, based on my understanding of the facts of the case, the officers would not have been able to get over the fence. So the young man gets to the fence, he climbs the fence very quickly, jumps over the fence, and as he's about to jump over the fence, one of the police officers shoots him in the back and kills him. So Tennessee versus Garner got all the way to the Supreme Court as a question of, do we still want to follow the fleeing felon rule? Is that still the rule now that we have prisons, we have ideas of rehabilitation, we don't want to execute every single person who commits a felony in this country anymore? What should we replace the fleeing felon rule with? So Tennessee versus Garner, Supreme Court came up with a balancing test that basically says the police no longer have the right to use all force, any force necessary to stop the person. It creates a reasonableness test where the police have to use their own judgment as to whether it is reasonable to use deadly force on a person who is not threatening anyone else in any fashion. Think about this. This young man is jumping over the fence. By the way, I should have said this as one of the facts. The young man has thrown his gun down. So he no longer has a deadly weapon on him. The police have seen him throw the gun down. And so what Tennessee versus Garner ultimately ruled was that the police do not have the authority to use deadly force unless someone's life is in danger. So you can see how that created the environment that then led to the creation of CIT. So CIT came along just a few years after Tennessee versus Garner, when people were trying to come up with ways to say, okay, we've now got a reasonableness test. We can't just shoot every felon who's running away from us. We can't just shoot every person who we find in a mental health crisis who might be threatening someone. We can't do that. So where is the balance? How do things work? Well, there's another case a couple years later that I will explain. I'll tell the story of it real quickly to tell you how this balancing test has come about. Because then, a couple years after Tennessee versus Garner, there's another case where involving mental health. Now, this one is very much a CIT case, a CIT officer. Today, in today's world, there would be a CIT officer called to come to this situation. There weren't any such thing as CIT officers when this situation occurred, but it created some of the rules that we teach law enforcement to follow in these situations. So, elderly man, well, in his 60s, known to have mental illness, known to have he's been involuntarily committed on multiple occasions. He and his wife get in the occasional spat. And especially when he's having some sort of mental health crisis situation. So he's in a mental health crisis right now at this moment. And he and his wife are yelling at each other, going back and forth. He pulls out a knife. She pulls out a knife. They're threatening each other with them. She finally gets him to go out on the front porch and she calls the police. So this was before cell phones. So she had to get him outside so she could get to her phone and dial and get the police there. Young police officer shows up, obviously not trained in CIT, and the mentally ill man is sitting sitting in a rocking chair on the front porch. He's rocking back and forth. I'm not in a rocking chair, but just imagine he's rocking back and forth, and he's holding the knife. He's got the knife in his hand. Young police officer comes up to him. And by the way, one of those things we train on safety, if an individual has a deadly weapon in their hand, the law enforcement officer should respond by pulling a deadly weapon. So this law enforcement officer doesn't have a knife, but he's got a gun. So he pulls his gun. He's got the gun trained on the man who's sitting in the rocking chair, rocking and holding his knife. And he's telling the guy, hey, you can't do this. You can't threaten your wife with a knife. She can't threaten you with a knife. We need to take you in to get you some treatment, get you some help. We need to take you to jail because there was no such thing as crisis care centers at the time. So as the police officer is getting ever closer to him, he gets about 10 feet away. And when he does, the mentally ill man stands up and starts to come at him with the knife. Well, at this point, when I'm doing presentation live, I would say, how many people think, tell me what happened to the elderly man? Well, I think most of y'all probably know what happened to him. The officer shot him and killed him. So then that becomes a question in the mental health arena. Was that under Tennessee versus Garner the correct use of force? Are you, in fact, in protecting this individual's constitutional rights? Now, I think everybody at that point went, "Oh, Wayne, what do you mean constitutional rights? What constitutional right are you talking about here?" This is a little weird. You're going to have to think outside the box with me, but this is what lawyers sometimes have to do, some mental gymnastics. So I want you to do one with me. It's the right to be secure in your person against illegal searches and seizures. So when you think about that, when we think about a search and a seizure, you think about going to somebody's house, and looking for the computer where where their emails are stored, or we think about going in and seizing a gun that might have been used in a crime or stuff like that. But the arrest of an individual constitutionally is a seizure. Okay, you search the individual and you seize them. Once you put them in handcuffs, you have seized the individual. And the killing of a citizen by a law enforcement officer is also considered to be a seizure. Now, I know that's a weird mental gymnastics concept, but that is constitutionally what you do when the officer fired on this man and caused his death. That's considered a seizure constitutionally. So the question becomes, did the young police officer exercise proper, reasonable force in the situation. Supreme Court ultimately ruled that that was okay. That because the officer's life was being threatened, very much unlike Tennessee versus Garner, where the guy's jumping over a fence and running away. Nobody's life's being threatened there. Here, the officer's life is being threatened, and to use deadly force was reasonable. So I hope that gives everybody sort of some idea of the context of the constitutional background of why we do CIT, how we do CIT, because it is way too often that the mentally ill individual that our folks confront in these situations do in fact have a deadly weapon. Y'all probably know, an individual who's mentally ill is not supposed to have a gun. They're not supposed to own a gun, but way too often they in fact do own a gun. Oftentimes it's ones that nobody knows about. Of course, it's fine for them to own a knife, which is a deadly weapon at times too. But that's sort of the constitutional background of where CIT comes from. So let me see. I want to talk about a couple of other constitutional issues in CIT. Again, as I say, that's sort of the background of what we've been emphasizing this year. The other constitutional issue that comes into play is in the course of the involuntary commitment. We talked a little bit about involuntary commitments one time when I was with y'all previously, but I want to go back through it just a little bit and talk about the elements that are required to prove an involuntary commitment. And of course, the first element is just that the individual has a mental illness. It's got to be proven by medical evidence, but in the first instance. But as we know, individuals have multiple commitments of these throughout the course of their lifetime. I think the record of anybody that I've talked to is 16 times when someone's been in and out of involuntary commitment, 16 times. So the person's got to be mentally ill, and they have to be a danger to themselves or others. They have to be a clear and present threat of substantial harm. So let's talk here real quick about the three fundamental rights that we all have as Americans. If you were in the classroom with me here together, you would all shout them out, but I'll just tell you what they are. It's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? So life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, mentioned in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson as the three things that Americans have a right to. So my question for you all would be, and if you want to do either a thumbs up or a thumbs down for yes or no, if you want to do that, for those who are out there who want to react, are those three rights absolute rights? What do you think? Are they absolute? I'll give about 10 seconds for anybody to think about that and see if anybody wants to vote. Are these rights absolute? They're fundamental. We know that. Are they absolute? There you go. All right. Jennifer's got the right answer here. The answer is no. They are not absolute rights. And we should know this because, people do in fact go to prison, right? And when you send someone to prison, it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those are the those three rights. And there are even times when the state extinguishes a person's right to life. And what we talk about in the CIT class with the officers is, when you think about that, everyone always goes immediately to capital punishment. And yes, okay, that is true. The state can sometimes extinguish a person's life through capital punishment, but it happens far, far, far more often when a police officer exercises reasonable force in a confrontation with a citizen. Think about how many more people in the country actually die in confrontations with law enforcement every year, as opposed to people who aren't executed by states throughout the course of the year. Because this is a weird concept to young law enforcement officers, especially the cadets. When I teach them, I look at them and stare them in the face and say, you are the state, because they are. I mean, the state has certain obligations to people not to violate their rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, except when, and here it comes, it's coming from behind my back here, it's going to overcome these rights. What it's called is a compelling interest. The compelling interest of the state can overcome a fundamental constitutional right. The state at times has the compelling interest to overcome those rights. And one of those situations, obviously one of those situations when somebody commits a crime, you take them to jail. Another one of those situations is this: when someone poses a real substantial threat of immediate harm to themselves or others, they can have their right to liberty extinguished. Now, understand, they aren't going to be taken to jail. That's not where you go. You actually take them into crisis care. And we built the Craig Crisis Care Center 3.5 years ago. Well, 3 years and 2 months ago now. It opened, and I'm so proud, y'all. The place, some of y'all are probably familiar with it. They're seeing an average of 200 to 250 people a month there. JBS is also recently, for those of you who are interested in juvenile issues, juvenile crisis issues. I know we talked about this with y'all before, is that the Crisis Care Center only takes people 19 and up. And I'm going to get on my soapbox here again and tell you all, if you know a legislator, if you can talk to a legislator, and every year, I talk to the legislators I know, and my own legislator, Neil Rafferty here, and my own Senator, Roger Smitherman, because I live in downtown Birmingham, and I tell them, look, y'all have got to fix this problem Alabama has with age of majority. Age of majority in Alabama is 19 years old, not 18 years old. So I'm going to get on my soapbox here and say real quick, why have we not lowered that age to 18? Because people between 18 and 19 fall in such a gap, and there's so many problems that happen. And I hear folks from JBS and folks in my CIT world complaining about this all the time, about the terrible gap in treatment, gap in care that a mentally ill individual has between the day they graduate high school, which they're still going to be 18 if they're on track, and the time they turn 19. And it's a problem with being unhoused. It's a problem with not getting proper medical care. It's a problem not getting proper food, and just everything becomes a problem there. So we need to lower that age to 18 so these folks can get more help. Let me step off of that soapbox now and say, JBS, in response to, I've told them, I'm on the JBS board now, and I've told them some of your comments and some things that people that I've met through Care Patrol have emailed me about and so on. And I've said, look, we've got to do something about this juvenile situation because the Craig Crisis Care Center cannot deal with juveniles. So they have actually created within the last year a juvenile crisis response team. And the juvenile crisis response team, they can't take them to the crisis care, but they can potentially get them to a hospital. They can get them to a place where the child can be cared for. And so anyway, stepping off of that, let me just say that if the person is a substantial threat of harm, immediate harm to themselves or others, they can be taken into crisis care. And we have to show by clear, convincing evidence that this is what's happening because the person has a constitutional right to liberty and to the pursuit of happiness. And yes, answering your question there, Jennifer, is the Juvenile Crisis Care Team a mobile team that goes out to help? Yes, they are. So, and I can get you, if you want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat in just a little while. If you want to email me about that, I can get you more information on that Juvenile Crisis Care Team because they've been doing some really, really good work. And by the way, for those who don't know, there are mobile crisis care teams. In a lot of the areas, the more rural areas of the state, they have adult mobile crisis care teams. Here, Jefferson County, of course, you can get to the Craig Crisis Care Center. In Shelby County, you can, but in some of the rural areas, and we now, very, very proud of this. My friend Kim Boswell, the Commissioner of Mental Health for the state of Alabama, has done a fantastic job. We now have 7 crisis care centers open. The 7th one opened in Dothan recently. So we now have them in Dothan, Tuscaloosa, in addition to the 5 that were open before that. So it's really, the crisis care system has really been well funded over the last few years. The Craig Crisis Care Center actually got almost a $2 million budget increase in last year's budget that was passed by the legislature. So very proud of that. And the Craig Crisis Care Center is the only one that opens on the only one that is open on a 24/7, 365 basis. The other 6 around the state operate lesser hours. They're not always open at night. They're not always open on holidays. But our crisis care center here in Birmingham is 24/7, 365. Like they took people into crisis care on Christmas Day this past year. So really proud of the work that those folks are doing. So let me go now to the next sort of constitutional issue that I hammer into the minds of these law enforcement officers, because the biggest complaint that I get about crisis care and involuntary commitment from law enforcement is, hey, Wayne, I worked so hard to get this person. They got them in bed. I've known they've needed help for the last 3 weeks. There's finally a bed came open. I finally got them there. The probate judge had the hearing. They sent them into the crisis care. And 4 days later, they're back out on the street and they're giving me trouble again. And that is a major, major sticking point with law enforcement. They will complain about, why does the healthcare system do this to people? I'm going to explain to you why that is, because element number 3 in the 4 elements it takes to get a person into involuntary commitment. I'm gonna read this one off my screen over here. It says, the individual being committed will continue to experience mental distress and deterioration of ability to function independently if not treated. Now, notice a couple things. The individual will continue to experience mental distress and deterioration of ability. So, mental distress, people who are mentally ill to this level are probably going to continue to experience, but that deterioration of ability language is very, 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 very important. Let me see if I can illustrate this. If you're looking at me on the screen, I'm going to try to do this. I know this is hard. It's much easier in person. An individual who has had a mental illness for a long period of time, let's say they're a high functioning person, they're working, they're okay. Maybe it's a person with substance use disorder and they've stopped, using opioids, or they've stopped using alcohol for a period of time. They're functioning. I'm going to move my hand up here. They're functioning at a really high level. Okay. So the individual then has a crisis. They fall back with an old friend and, over the weekend, and they use opioids or they use alcohol or whatever, or maybe just the individual decides to stop taking a certain medication that was really helping them, and they start into a crisis mode and they become a danger to themselves or others. So they go down, so the state intervenes. And the state gets them. They're still going down, right? They're still in crisis mode. They're still deteriorating. The moment that person flattens out and is no longer deteriorating, if you see my hand, it's a much lower level now. The moment they flatten out, they have a constitutional right to be released. I understand that's odd, right? But when you think about it, it is in fact the constitutional right. The state, remember the fundamental rights, the compelling interest. When the individual is in crisis, the state has a compelling interest to deprive them of their right to liberty. Once they are stabilized, even if it is at a much, much, much lower level of functioning, once they are stabilized, the state's compelling interest goes away, and the state must release them because of their constitutional right to liberty as an American citizen. So I hope that makes sense to everyone. This is what I try to explain to the police officers, because they will, and when I say it, I will say I always see lights going off around the room. They're like, oh, I never understood why that is, why we let them out. And I will mention here one thing I know we talked about in one of my previous presentations, where did this rule come from? And well, let me say this first. The 4th element is that the individual is unable to make a rational decision regarding treatment. Well, lawyers are all about logic, and I'm just going to give you the logic of this situation here. Person is mentally ill, they're a danger to themselves or others, and they're getting worse, right? They're deteriorating. Their ability to function is deteriorating. If all 3 of those things are true and they don't want to get treatment, they are not making a rational decision. And so element number 4 is satisfied. I've always logically wondered why element number 4 is even there. I understand why it's there, because they want to say, the person, if the person could make a rational decision. But the weird part is sometimes we see people in this situation. And I train my law enforcement folks all the time to watch for this and listen for this. And that is, many times these individuals want to go to voluntary treatment. They are fine with it. They know they need treatment. They've been through this before. They're in a crisis situation, and they were just looking for somebody to come and help them. And last week, we had our 40-hour class, and my two social workers who helped to teach the class, one of them had to leave on a Monday afternoon because someone had been called in for crisis, had been called out to a scene to get someone into crisis care. We had a bed available, person needed to go into crisis care. So the social worker goes out to help out our law enforcement folks who are going to find this individual and bring them in to the bed. When they get there, they say, "Hey, we're bringing you in for an involuntary commitment hearing." And the lady who has been in involuntary commitment multiple times before, she basically looked at the law enforcement officer and was like, "Thank goodness you're here. I need your help." And looked at the social worker and said, "What do you need me to sign? I'm coming. I want to go." So at that point, it becomes a voluntary commitment, not an involuntary commitment. And we no longer have to worry about constitutional rights at that point, right? Because it's not an involuntary commitment. You don't have to have a compelling interest to keep someone who wants to be helped. So the theory being the state, and look at my hand again, you're functioning up here, you go into the crisis mode, stabilize. The state has no constitutional responsibility to bring the individual back up to here. Okay. Now, they may voluntarily want to get back up to there. They may want to go into treatment and make sure they're getting proper treatment. They may want to get back on their medication. They may want to stop taking the opioids, stop taking the alcohol, whatever the situation is. They may want to get back up to that level of functioning, but the state is no longer responsible for getting them up to there, because the state has no constitutional responsibility to provide medical treatment to an individual who is not an involuntary commitment. I know that's a weird concept, but there's no constitutional right to medical care in the United States unless the state has put you in involuntary confinement. So people in the jail and people in involuntary commitment, they have a constitutional right to have their medical care done, paid for by the government. But once that is no longer the case, the government no longer pays for it. Let me spend my last few minutes talking, for those who weren't with us before, about why and where this rule came from, because I think it's very, very important that everybody understands sort of the background of this situation. I've got about 5 minutes left before I want to turn it back over to Sean for maybe a couple of questions at the end. But I just want to make sure that everybody knows that Alabama, we have a right to be very, very proud of the role that we played in the history of reforming mental health care in the entire world, really. Because in 1970, there was a lawsuit filed, and some of you know the lawsuit, one of the primary lawyers on the lawsuit is actually still alive. His name is Jack Drake, and he's a friend of mine. He's in his 80s now. Jack's just written a book. It's called Be Not Afraid. Go get a copy of it. Anyway, but Jack tells the story in there about a case called Wyatt versus Stickney. Ricky Wyatt was a 15-year-old child who had been at Bryce Hospital since he was 10 years old. And he was there primarily because his stepmother didn't like dealing with him. Ricky's mother had left the family when he was 2. His father got married again. That stepmother left him when he was 5. His father got married a third time. And this time he married a woman who had 2 children of her own. And she didn't particularly like Ricky. And so Ricky got in a little trouble at school when he was in the 5th grade. And the stepmom went to the dad and said, "Hey, Ricky's having trouble at school. I think there's something wrong with him mentally. We need to get him sent away." So they went to the local probate judge in Pike County down in Troy, and the local judge, Ricky Watt's dad, knew the probate judge, and the probate judge was like, "Yep, okay." And at 10 years old, sent Ricky to Bryce Hospital. 5 years later, Ricky was chosen as the representative plaintiff for Bryce Hospital, and honestly, for hundreds of thousands of Americans, because the lawsuit that was filed basically said, "State, you have so many people at Bryce Hospital who don't belong there." And when they started investigating, and by the way, the case is called Wyatt versus Stickney. Commissioner Stonewall Stickney was a doctor who was a psychiatrist who was in charge of Bryce Hospital, was the commissioner of Alabama Department of Mental Health at the time, and he agreed with the lawsuit. He thought the lawsuit was well taken, because what they found, and of course, Dr. Stickney knew a lot about this. When they got to Bryce Hospital, when the judge started investigating, the lawyers started finding all this out, was that the 5,000 people who were at Bryce, of those 5,000 people, only about 400 of them even had treatment plans in place. The other 4,600 of those people at Bryce Hospital in 1970 in Alabama were mostly battered women. And many of them were children who had gotten in trouble at school whose parents wanted to get rid of them in some fashion. They had gone to local probate judge. Think about a woman in the 1940s, 1950s in the state of Alabama goes to her husband and says, "You're mistreating me. You're beating me every night. You're beating my children. You're doing terrible things to us, and I want a divorce." So the culture of the day, that man could go to the probate judge and say, "My wife has gone crazy." And the probate judge would send these women to Bryce Hospital. If you've ever seen the cemeteries out there, 90% of the people buried at Bryce Hospital are women. Many of them are women who were there for decades. And so when this lawsuit was filed, what they said was, these people don't belong there. They're not mentally ill. You're not treating them properly. And what the case ultimately ruled, Judge Frank Johnson ultimately ruled about this case, he said, you cannot put someone in involuntary commitment. You can't seize the individual. Remember, we were talking about, yes, patriarchy at its finest, Lisa. That's 100% correct. So you can't seize these individuals and put them into involuntary confinement, sometimes for decades, on the basis of them having an illness and then refuse to treat that illness, which is what they were doing. There were no treatment plans for these folks. For the 5,000 people at Bryce, anybody want to guess how many doctors there were? 2. There was 1 psychiatrist on staff. There was 1 general physician on staff. The social workers had caseloads, technical caseloads of 400 people each. Now, those of you who are social workers on this call, is there any way you could deal with 400 cases at a time? I've been told by my social worker friends that 30 to 40 is a really heavy caseload. 400 is impossible. So they made them lay off some of these employees, even as bad as things were at Bryce. And oh, by the way, I should mention, things were probably even worse. They didn't do a full investigation at Searcy Hospital down in Mobile County, where there were 4,000 more Alabamians being held in involuntary commitment, most of whom were Black citizens. So for the most part, Bryce had white involuntary commitment. Searcy had Black involuntary commitment. And y'all, it was just a nightmare. There were lobotomies were fairly common, high dose medicines, electric shock treatments, all the things that you remember hearing about the terrible ways that people in mental health were treated. This was what was going on at Bryce. And this case set out the law that I've been talking to y'all about today. These people have constitutional rights. They have a right. And so that's why when someone finishes that crisis, when the crisis ends, no matter what level they're at, you let them out, because they have a constitutional right, because we don't want to go back to the way it was before this White versus Stickney was filed in 1970. Now, White versus Stickney, by the way, never got to the Supreme Court, Sean, and I'll turn it back over to you in just a second, but never got to the Supreme Court. You know why it never got to the Supreme Court? Because everybody agreed that the judge was right. There was no reason to appeal, because both sides were like, yeah, Judge, you're right about this. We've got to fix this. Now, the way the state of Alabama went about fixing is, and if anybody's ever been to Bryce, there are large buildings at Bryce that were built to take care of these 5,000 patients, 4,500 of whom were released within 2 years. So there are buildings at Bryce Hospital now that were never used. So yes, we've come a very long way, no doubt. In the way we handle things now, things are much, much better in Alabama today. We've got a ways to go. The crisis care system needs to get better. And I'm out here working every day to try to make sure that law enforcement understands their role in it and understands how important it is that they treat these people with respect, with dignity, and make sure that they know the 4 plays and go out and get these folks properly brought into crisis care. Sean, I've talked for way too long. We might have time for 1 or 2 questions. I will, and thank y'all so much for your attention today. I'm going to drop that link into the chat one more time to sign up for the class, and I'm going to put my email there as well. So, all right, Sean, there you go.
Terrific, Wayne. I've got to ask you to come back again. It's always so enjoyable, and we learn so much when you're here.
Happy to do it, man.
Today's evaluation link, for those of you who are seeking a certificate, you must do the evaluation. It is password protected. The link is https:// www.surveymonkey.com/lowercase r/ all uppercase letters, V as in victory, Z as in zoo, Y, Q, Z as in zoo, W, Y. That is the evaluation link for the certificate. The password is capital C, lowercase a-r-e, care. The password is care. I don't see any questions, Wayne. I have, yes, I'll repeat the link. Yes, I certainly will. https:// www.surveymonkey.com/lowercase r/ all uppercase, V as in victory, Z as in zoo, Y, Q, Z as in zoo, W, Y, and the password is care. I'm posting that into the chat room. I think Miss Erin, you did as well. I appreciate that. You see Wayne's email for those of you who are watching this on YouTube. And by the way, you can see this again on YouTube if you'd like to revisit it. Wayne Rogers' email, if you'd like to contact him, is I just lost it. Rogers W at jccal.com.
Don, it's the Rogers WA. Don't forget the A.
Oh,
So
W
there
A.
is a Rogers W who's not me. So
Okay, yeah, we're
Rogers
sending to the wrong
WA at
person.
jccal.org. Yep, there you go.
Thank you so much, Wayne. And I do, I shy from the political on these courses, but you're running for Secretary of State. And I
Yes,
wanted to mention that. And I thank you for
thank
your
you.
service of not only Jefferson County citizens, but the state citizens. Best of luck.
Thank you so much, Sean. And thanks everybody for your great attention today. I really always love being with y'all.
Thank you. And for those of you that like to attend our series, join us again on Tuesday, May 5th. We're presenting a clinical certificate CEU. Dr. Rebecca Sipma of UAB will address epilepsy, which will be really quite interesting as well. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for all that you do. I hope you have a great few weeks and enjoy this wonderful weather. Thank you again, Wayne, and everyone take care.
Thanks, Sean. Great to see y'all.
All right.